The host aimed to make an example out of Stallone, but instead he became the perfect illustration of why so many people have lost faith in mainstream media. The studio lights were glaring, too glaring, the kind that made people sweat even when they weren't nervous. But Sylvester Stallone wasn't nervous. He leaned back in his chair, legs spread apart, shoulders relaxed, and waited. The audience murmured in anticipation, some already clutching their phones, ready to record. They could sense something big was coming. Sitting opposite him was Ethan Caldwell, a polished TV host known for his sharp dress, progressive views, and love for gotcha moments. He leaned forward, a smug grin creeping across his face. He had interviewed everyone from politicians to activists to Hollywood elites, always managing to make them stumble. But Stallone? He was new ground. "Mr. Stallone," Ethan began, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "You've long been a symbol of American toughness. But do you think that kind of masculinity is outdated? Don't you think in today's world we should redefine strength to be more inclusive?" A few audience members chuckled, others nodded in agreement, Ethan's supporters expecting him to trap Stallone. The actor blinked slowly, a deliberate pause, then leaned forward, elbows on his knees, exhaling deeply. "So you're asking if being tough is a problem now?" he asked. Ethan's grin widened. "I think we're past the time when men should solve their problems with fists. Don't you think the world's moved on from that thinking?" A silence filled the room. Long, enough to make people squirm. Stallone scratched his chin, then burst into laughter. Not a polite chuckle, but a deep, genuine laugh. "You're serious?" he said finally. "You think toughness is a problem?" Ethan adjusted his tie. "I think it can be toxic when it discourages vulnerability." Stallone nodded slowly as if processing the statement, then leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms across the backrest. "Let me ask you something," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "If someone broke into your house tonight, do you want a tough guy in there, or do you want someone who's going to sit down and talk about their feelings?" The audience gasped, some clapping. Ethan opened his mouth, but Stallone wasn't finished. "See, toughness isn't about punching walls or yelling loudest. It's about standing your ground when life knocks you down. It's about protecting your family. It's about discipline, respect, hard work. And if you think the world doesn't need that anymore..." He shook his head. "I don't know what world you're living in, man." Ethan forced a smile, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He hadn't expected Stallone to hit back so quickly, but he wasn't backing down. "All right," Ethan said, shifting in his seat. "But don't you think Hollywood, and, let's be honest, your own films, have glorified violence as the only answer to problems?" Stallone didn't hesitate. "Hollywood glorifies a lot of things. Ever seen a movie where a guy saves the world by filling out paperwork?" Laughter rippled through the room, even from some of Ethan's crew. But Ethan wasn't finished. He still had more tricks, but Stallone was just getting started. Ethan straightened his posture, flipping through his notes, looking for his next move. He was good at controlling the flow, leading guests into tight spots. But Stallone wasn't playing along. "All right, let's talk about influence," Ethan said, flipping a card. "You've built a career playing tough, no-nonsense characters, guys who solve problems with fists, guns, or brute force. Do you ever think about the message that sends? Don't you think you have a responsibility to promote a more progressive kind of hero?" The way Ethan emphasized progressive let the audience know exactly where this was headed. Stallone smirked. He sat up, shoulders squared, ready for the next round. "First of all," Stallone said, steady, "I make movies. Movies aren't real, you know that, right?" He raised an eyebrow. "I mean, last time I checked, I never actually went 15 rounds with Apollo Creed. Never took down an army with a red bandana and a knife. Never ran up those steps in Philly and solved everyone's problems." A few people laughed, but Ethan didn't relent. "Sure, but movies shape culture," he countered. "Kids grow up watching Rambo and Rocky. Shouldn't we be giving them heroes who solve problems without violence?" Stallone exhaled through his nose. "Man, you ever seen Rocky?" He shook his head. "That whole movie was about getting back up when life knocks you down. It wasn't about beating people up, it was about heart, perseverance, and Rambo. He shrugged. That guy was just trying to be left alone. If people had just let him walk through town and mind his business, none of that would have happened. The audience clapped a little louder. Ethan clenched his jaw. This wasn't going according to plan. He leaned forward, softer now, more personal. Okay, fair enough, Ethan said. But let's talk about the real world. America today is questioning what it means to be a man, what it means to be tough. Some say your version of toughness, the old school don't show weakness. Kind is part of the problem, that it divides more than it unites. What do you say to that? Stallone let the question linger, tapping his fingers on the armrest, eyes locked on Ethan. You ever meet a firefighter? He asked. Ethan blinked. Excuse me? A firefighter, a cop, a military guy. Hell, even a single mom working 2 jobs to keep food on the table. You ever talk to those people? You think toughness is their problem? Stallone shook his head. No, man. Their toughness is what keeps the world running. The problem isn't toughness, it's thinking strength is bad like it's dangerous. Weakness isn't a virtue, pal. Strength with control. That's what keeps people safe. Someone in the back let out a low whistle. The energy in the room had shifted. Ethan was losing control, but Stallone raised a hand, stopping him. You want to know the real problem? Stallone leaned forward. It's not toughness. It's people who talk about toughness like it's the enemy while living in a world built and protected by tough people. You sit here in your nice suit with your scripted questions, trying to tell me what's outdated. Let me tell you something, man. If the world ever really goes sideways, if things get bad, you're going to be real happy there are still guys like me around. Dead silence. Ethan swallowed hard. He had more questions lined up, but the audience wasn't with him anymore. They were waiting for Stallone's next words. And Stallone, he wasn't done. Ethan shifted uneasily in his chair. The energy had completely slipped from his grasp. He had entered the interview expecting an easy target, a celebrity who would crumble under pressure. But Stallone wasn't stumbling. He wasn't defensive. He was owning the room. And now the audience wasn't just listening, they were rooting for him. Ethan forced a smile. I hear you, he said, trying to regain control. But let's be real. Society has changed. We don't live in the same world we did when you made Rocky. People are more aware now. We're critically thinking about gender roles, systemic issues. Thinking critically? Stallone interrupted, raising an eyebrow. Or just criticizing? The room erupted. Some clapped, some gasped, and even Ethan's own camera crew exchanged glances. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a battle. Ethan held up his hands. Okay, he said, trying to regain his composure. So, let me ask you this. If strength, if toughness is so important, why do so many people push back against it? Why do so many feel it's outdated? Stallone let the question hang in the air for a moment, then leaned in, his voice lower now, almost conspiratorial. Because weak people don't like being reminded they're weak. The crowd erupted. Some stood, clapping, others stunned. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Stallone let the moment ride before leaning back. Look, he said, I'm not saying everybody needs to be an action hero. I'm saying life's going to throw punches whether you like it or not, and when it does, the world's not going to care about your feelings. It's going to ask you one question. Can you take the hit and keep moving forward? Ethan was silent, defeated. But outside the studio, the conversation was just beginning. The moment the interview ended, Ethan barely managed to keep his smile as the cameras cut. But Stallone stood, stretched, and gave the audience a small wave before walking off the set like it was just another day. Backstage, producers scrambled. Ethan's earpiece buzzed with frantic voices. That didn't go as planned. Social media is already picking it up. Cut the controversial parts before we post it online. But it was too late. Someone in the live audience had already uploaded clips. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Stallone slams TV host. Stallone dismantles woke media and live debate. This is why we still need real men like Stallone. The video spread like wildfire, trending across every platform. The days passed, the conversation didn't die down. The clip was everywhere. Morning shows, podcasts, news segments. People weren't just talking about Stallone. They were talking about something bigger. Had modern society really gone soft? Was real strength necessary? Or had it been vilified? Stallone didn't say a word, no tweets, no press releases. He simply went about his day. But in the midst of the noise, the question remained, what kind of strength do we really value? The debate didn't die down with time, nor did the conversation ever truly fade. It became a defining moment, a point in modern culture where people had to ask themselves whether they were ready to face uncomfortable truths or whether they preferred to keep living in an echo chamber. For the people who had been living under the influence of a media narrative that framed strength as something toxic, Stallone's words had become a light that cut through the fog. His statement, delivered so casually yet with such precision, had cracked open something that had been simmering below the surface. And while Stallone went back to his daily life, unaffected and at peace, those who had been caught in the firestorm had to adjust. Ethan Caldwell, once the bright, progressive star in the media spotlight, now faced the fallout from his failed attempt at a gotcha interview. His show's ratings plummeted, not because the world suddenly realized his views were wrong, but because they had seen someone who claimed to speak for the common people be outwitted and humiliated by someone who, in their eyes, embodied the spirit of resilience that the media had long forgotten to portray. Ethan's next few interviews felt flat, forced, his credibility shattered by that single viral moment. He was still on air, but he was no longer the media darling. The backlash to the interview wasn't simply about Stallone's position on toughness. It was a rejection of the manipulation that often came with it. On the other side of the equation, Stallone wasn't playing into the drama. He didn't need to. He didn't need to justify anything to the public. For him, it wasn't about winning an argument, it was about standing firm in his beliefs, something he had always done throughout his career. He had always been a man who faced adversity head-on, whether it was in his films or his life. That day in the hot studio lights, he simply embodied that same ethos. No stage or camera could intimidate him. No host's sharp words could make him falter. It was like a reminder that strength doesn't always scream loudest. Sometimes it's just quietly standing your ground, whether people are watching or not. But the world didn't forget. And it wasn't just Stallone's fans who celebrated him. Everyday people who lived in the trenches of life, whether as workers in physically demanding jobs, parents raising children in difficult circumstances, or individuals overcoming personal challenges, they connected with what he had said. The narrative began to shift. Strength was no longer defined by how much noise you could make, but by how much you could endure, how much you could take and keep going. It wasn't about flexing muscles or bravado. It was about resilience, character, and integrity, the kind of toughness that keeps the world turning when everything seems to be falling apart. This cultural shift started showing up in more subtle ways. Social media began to overflow with posts about perseverance, grit, and overcoming obstacles. Parents shared stories of teaching their children to face challenges with strength and dignity. Teachers and coaches began to incorporate these lessons into their curricula, no longer focusing solely on academic or athletic success, but on developing resilience and perseverance in their students. Even young men, who were often the target of the conversation about toxic masculinity, began to redefine what it meant to be strong. They weren't just showing up in boxing gyms, as Stallone's movies often encouraged, but they were also taking on the less glamorous battles, standing up for their values in tough conversations, working through their mental health struggles, and showing up for the people who depended on them. But not everyone was ready to accept the shift. The media, both mainstream and social, began to divide into two camps. One side saw Stallone's moment as a reminder of a forgotten virtue, while the other decried it as a resurgence of outdated and dangerous ideals. The divide grew deeper, as each side clung to their beliefs, unwilling to accept that perhaps both sides had valid points. For Stallone, it was all a little ironic. After all, he had spent his career playing characters who fought, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively, against forces trying to break them down. He had never been the man trying to impose his version of toughness on anyone. He had just always believed that when things got tough, real strength is what pulls you through. And while the media scrambled to find the next viral sensation, Stallone simply went back to what he had always known. He didn't need to be a political figure or a voice for a movement. He was just a man who had spent his life learning how to stand tall when life knocked him down. But the world had learned something. They had learned that the media's narratives, built around gotcha moments and manufactured outrage, were no longer enough to drown out the truth. Stallone didn't need a platform to speak his truth. His life had been a testament to it. And when the moment came to stand up for something larger than himself, he did it not through grand speeches but through simple honesty. In the end, it wasn't about Stallone proving anything. It was about the world proving something to itself. That real strength is quieter than we think, and it's something far more powerful than anyone on a screen can ever fully control. And for those paying attention, they had received a subtle yet seismic wake-up call.